As already indicated, what I want to do here is talk about some of the great changes, particularly of the second half of the 20th century, bearing in mind that they flow directly out of the kinds of images being shown here out of the Industrial Revolution and the colonial sweep of the globe that was done out of mainly the industrial nations. They are hand in glove, and there are all sorts of different ways in which they produce significant economic, technological, and more significantly for a unit like this, social effects. Just very recently, there was an announcement by the West Australian government that they were going to change the name of a geographical feature in the Kimberley from the King Leopold Ranges to the Woonamin-Millawundi Ranges. And you will read a little bit about why King Leopold is on the nose currently, and described in this particular article, you'll note, tyrant in inverted commas. I think when you read that little bit about him, you'll see there's no need for inverted commas. Marx and Engels, recognizing the global way back in 1848, in that moment, in those moments of industrial upheaval, and of course, incredible kind of growth, the need of a constantly expanding market for its product chases the bourgeoisie over the entire surface of the globe, they note. It's a beautiful piece of writing. I commend it to you, and you might even just want to pause this video here to have a read of what they're saying as they move their way through Marx and Engels through this description of, in quite beautiful prose really, straightforward in a way too, but such wonderful clarity that they pick up some of the grand and cataclysmic changes. It's cited in Lechler, one of your readings for last week. And they note, Lechler and his colleagues, three dimensions in this particular paragraph extracted from the Communist Manifesto. Economic change, and that's what you'd expect of a Marx-Engels analysis of the world. But that economic change being very much hand in glove with technological change. They're chasing each other around here. And then significantly still also the social changes that they note. A global bourgeoisie finding their places in different parts of the world, building a cosmopolitanism beyond nation is really what's being suggested there. At the same time as they hint at in that particular paragraph, some of the ways in which the inequalities are now becoming spread globally. I don't think they use the phrase there, but there's a sense of the proletarianization of the world, the ways in which people are being drawn into the wage economy and alienated from previous ways of life. So Lechler et al. Make the point that globalization is not a phenomenon that can be reduced to economics and economic analysis. On the contrary, a phenomenon with social dimensions, socioeconomic, sociopolitical, sociocultural ones, which a sociological perspective is best able to capture. What I want to do right here, right now, as already indicated, is offer a kind of skeleton of a set of concepts, placing it into a historical context so that you can start to build a narrative out of this, and a narrative that has this double focus on the what is now called the global south compared with the global north, which I'd like to suggest to you is more commonly thought of as the west. So there's a confusion of hemispheres in these geographical this geographical categorization of the world. The global south used to be known as the third world, and there's a recognition of the inadequacies of that term. Developing nations, and what they have in common is most, if not all of them, are former colonies. Global north, the west, on the other hand, the first world, as it was once called, the industrialized nations of the world, as they were once called, that no longer applies. Industrialization has been offshored. Often the colonizers, so it's often the European nations with obviously the US and Australia. Australia did have a colony at one stage in Papua New Guinea. To put some flesh on the skeleton I just talked about, the conceptual skeleton that I'm about to offer, Vesh is one of the people I draw upon. You've already had a look at his introduction to his particular book, The Art of Being Human. I take you now to chapter 8 in Globalization. And there you're going to find a coverage of the Global South in particular, with a series of small vignettes, small case studies that start to build a bigger picture of the momentous changes that have taken place in the kind of period of time that we're considering. To offer some sort of coverage of what's happened in the period under consideration here, I turn to an article by Tontz and Jones. Matthew Tontz is currently the executive dean of the faculty in which I'm located. Many of you also will be located in. From state paternalism to neoliberal reform in Australian rural policy. And here he draws specifically on Western Australian wheat belt rurality, rural policy, to illustrate the points he's making. So bringing it fairly close to home, I imagine for some of you, it is home. So what we're aiming for here is for you to build a double narrative, to come out of this module able to tell in broad brushstrokes. It has to be that the stories of change, of social change, triggered by the kinds of economic and political commitments and changes that have taken place, and coupled with the technological shifts as well. But how this has changed the ways in which society works, operates, and some of its basic structures, and the implications of these changes on the people who are being affected by it. That's the kind of narrative we're looking for you to build. Now, I just want to put a note of caution here into your own thinking. Beware of unilineal evolutionism. It doesn't apply to the biological models of human evolution. If we think about if we think of it in straight lines from ape to Homo sapiens sapiens, it's a mistake. It's nowhere near as simple as that. It doesn't happen in a nice, simple, linear progression. Trees are probably more apt metaphors, and even they can be just a bit too two-dimensional. Perhaps it needs to be a three-dimensional model that we're exploring. So be aware of that. Beware of thinking about societies as falling into some sort of chain of being, chain of progress. And some of the ways in which they've been captured historically is beliefs in the idea that human societies move from savagery to civilization, from being underdeveloped to developed, from pre-industrial societies, just think about what that term implies about societies, to becoming industrialized ones. From primitive to modern is another way in which these kind of lines of thought come into play. It's nowhere near as simple as this. And of course, think about it. There's a sense that there's an inevitability to it, a march of progress. And there's interesting thoughts to contemplate there about what does progress mean in amongst all this. So a term that's key in all of this, which is key to often to sociological thought. Sociology is seen as being born in modernity, is the study of modernity in lots of ways. A period of time, but also a conceptualization world, an understanding again of change that's rooted in the Enlightenment, that period of time that sort of swept away the ancient regimes, monarchy, privileges of the nobility, and the political power of the church. The French Revolution is often seen as emblematic of this Enlightenment movement. And of course, in that case, it's a Catholic Church that's being swept away, but you've also got Protestantism also sweeping away the influence of the Catholic Church in that regard, and that is significant. Part of the Enlightenment movement, many would say. Immanuel Kant, the famous German philosopher, catches a phrase that it's one among many of the period, but that helps capture some of the spirit of the Enlightenment. Dare to know, have courage to use your own reason. And I think in that you can hear some of the elements here associated with modernity, the rise of capitalism, industrialization, democratic rule, the rise of the nation state. All of these things sit together hand in hand, if four hands. Secularization, another key part of this, a movement away from belief in supreme beings, and of course all the sovereignty relies that kings and queens relied upon with regards to that to legitimize their rule. Individualization captured pretty much in the Kant quote there, but an increasing sense of the individual being responsible, in charge of their own destiny in some way or another. I want to be looking at these kinds of this sort of periodization. Colonialism, I've already spoken about, and you're going to, that underpins much of this. It keeps moving through this. And I want to move pretty quickly to World War II developments, or post-World War II developments. Excuse me. And in those, some of those developments, independence, post-colonialism. You've also got the economic boom happening in the West, Cold War emerging, the creation of three worlds, and the ways in which the third world gets constructed as a place that needs the beneficence, the assistance of the first world, bringing all that it can to assist it in its development. Mass migration, another period of mass migration. It's not the only period, of course. It was part of that. The building of the welfare state, or at least the strengthening of it in somewhere like Australia and New Zealand, which had led the world really in the development of welfare states. And then as we move along into the second half, into the last final quarter of the 20th century, we see movements towards neoliberalism. Some also refer to it as a postmodern era. We've gone beyond the modern in many ways. I mean, that's one of the arguments. We're not going to get very lost in that. In the Global South, there was, in many parts of the Global South, there was a significant crisis caused by debt, a debt crisis, a loan crisis, which triggered structural adjustment in the economies, and that's pretty much summed up in the idea of privatization, moving away from government to private, which is very much also a part of the neoliberal movement, so neoliberal moment even, and so you get this sense of shifts in the way society is being organized across the globe. I want to just introduce a couple of terms that help us think our way through what we're doing. Eric Wolf, 1982, in his masterful book, Europe and the People Without History, wrote about the modes of production, the major ways in which humans organize their production of foods and goods. Now, let's say he wrote about it. He was building on ideas coming, very much inspired out of Marx and Engels' writing. A specific historically occurring set of relations through which labor is deployed to wrest energy from nature by means of tools, skill, organization, and knowledge. So that's what he's defining. That's how he's defining the notion of mode of production. So some way of making a living using labor, and how the ways in which that gets organized. And he suggests there's three ways in which this gets organized. The tributary mode, where the surpluses are being extracted from primary producers, the peasants, who are producing food for their own consumption, plus a form of tax, I suppose, to their rulers, the political or military rulers. A kin-ordered mode, where the means of committing social labour achieved through appeals to filiation and marriage. Horticultural societies, hunter-gatherer societies fit very much into this category. And then there's a capitalist mode, where monetary wealth enables some people to buy the labour power of others. Significant movement mode change. Just to emphasize that a bit more, the capitalist mode of production, labor is an attribute of Homo sapiens. It's not in itself a commodity created for sale. What's happened, and what often happens in society, is we get socialized into the ways of thinking of that society, the ideologies, the dominant ideologies. Something like labor becomes very naturalized. Getting paid for wages becomes very naturalized. But we've got to remember, it's a this has only existed for a very, very short period of time. So then when labour power is offered for sale, the relationship between producers and the means of production is severed. Alienation is how Marx described that. Two broad groups, again, very much the Marxist dichotomy between the owners of the means of production and those selling their labour, capitalists versus the workers or the proletariat. So another idea which I think is really useful, which you won't read about in either of the readings that you have, the notion of the Great Transformation, Great Transformations. Polanyi, 1957, all those years ago. He associates the Great Transformation as being something about the mid-19th century, Industrial Revolution. where trade gets linked with peace. So the Organization of Trade prior to this was very much military and warlike. Yeah? So that's an important element to pick up. The pirates, the armed caravan, the hunter, the trapper, the sword-bearing merchant, and the adventurers, the explorers, the slave traders. And then there's the colonial armies of the chartered companies, the Dutch East India Company, which we kind of know a bit of in terms of the West Australian history, and the British East India Company, to name but two. 19th century trade, Polanyi argues, was dependent upon an international monetary system. So we're getting nations starting to cooperate there around this, hence his linking of trade with peace. We also, really, the great transformation occurs through the Industrial Revolution, starting, according to many, in the 1780s in England, defined by the development of machines and the establishment of market economies. And Polanyi's unique contribution, one of his unique contributions, is to start raising this issue of the market society, a society built around the market. Key idea. Machine production. I'll get myself out of the way there. Just keep moving along. Whoops, I'll come and join you up here. I'll come and join you up here. Let me just do this. Excuse me, everyone, and I hope to just keep trying to do this in one take. Machine production transforms a natural and human substance of society into commodities. Significant moment. This is the great transformation. I loved, when I first, having just read some Polanyi, I came across this New Yorker cartoon. I love real estate. It's so tangible. Again, another example of something that gets very naturalized in the world we're in. But the point that Polanyi is trying to make for us is, I'll just keep moving around here, folks, finding comfortable positions for myself. He talks about fictitious commodities, goods that were not originally produced for sale. Land, labor, and money. None of them produced for sale, but then a market emerged in the Industrial Revolution as things start to get reorganized. Land for rent, labor for wages, money for interest. They start to generate profit. And this makes a huge difference. Alienation, just to remind that phrase coming out of Marx, when people start to sell their labor and land starts to become a commodity as well. People get moved off the land, they move into the industrial centers, they become wage laborers, exploited by the capitalists, as Marx would say. Given new opportunities is how maybe the industrialists would see it, the capitalists would see it. And they are alienated from their product and, of course, also from the land. And that's where I often think about, well, what did happen to my ancestors? And many of them, I imagine, were involved in this very movement, the ways in which they were once dependent on the land for their sustenance, and then they become dependent upon money to be able to purchase whatever they can from those owning land and producing goods for sale in the marketplace. In the novel Great Expectations, there's an interesting moment in there. I'm not going to go into the details of this, but Pip is the central hero of this. He is in a poor family and in brutal times, but he suddenly gets an inheritance from somebody who he'd given some help to in escaping from prison, but who nevertheless ended up in Australia. And he's just come into his fortune. He moves into London. He comes as a gentleman into London, but of course remember that he was not raised in that kind of a manner. And he meets one Herbert Pocket in a club in London, who he befriends. And one day they're sitting around having cigars, having probably some port. And Herbert Pocket observes, "I think I shall trade to the East Indies for silk shawls, spices, dyes, drugs, and precious woods. It's an interesting trade." And Pip says, "And the profits are large?" "Tremendous," said Herbert. I wavered again and began to think that they were greater expectations than my own. "I think I shall trade also," said he, putting his thumbs into his waistcoat pockets. to the West Indies for sugar, tobacco and rum, also to Ceylon, especially for elephant tusks. Oh, you want a good many ships, said I. Oh, tremendous, said he. Now, when I read this, I'm preparing for lectures in this area. I was thinking about how if I was in the same position as these two young aspiring gentlemen moving in their time and place, would I have been able to think differently? Would I have been able to think about the exploitation that was involved in this? Or would I be very much focused on my own advancement? It's just that sense of, it's easy for us to look back and condemn all that went on, but just imagine being there. And this is one of those moments where I could imagine if being placed in those positions, what it might have meant. So just reminding you of this focus we have, shifting straight through to the post-World War II developments, John Maynard Keynes. And this is one of the persons who's now being talked about again, and you may be picking up some of that discussion of Keynesianism. In 1919, he wrote a book about the economic consequences of the peace, and he predicted from that there'd need to be another war because Germany's debt, the ways in which Germany was forced into debt in part of that peace, in the peace agreements from the First World War, would cripple their society and would cause enormous resentment. So he did predict that this would destabilize that country. He didn't exactly get to fascism, but that's what arose, as we know. But the points he goes on to make as an economist, government intervention stabilizes the economy. We cannot rely on free markets to drive down unemployment. We need to actually drive demand, consumer demand, absolutely vital here. And this is the kind of thinking that became central to the post-World War II rebuilding in the global north, the West. And we see from the end of the Second World War right through to the 70s, one of the really long economic booms of history. And it's built around manufacturing. Car making is probably emblematic of that, but all sorts of use of steel making and and chemicals and so on. I mean, the list is not endless, but it's certainly pretty long. Nation building projects. I've got a picture here of the Snowy River Mountain Scheme, one of the grand symbols of post-World War II expansion and the long boom in Australia, bringing with it great amounts of labour migration in a settler nation like Australia. We'll come to more of that later on in the unit. We also find that that's a time, of course, of the Cold War. That's where the Second World is identified, those behind the Iron Curtain, the communist nations. And in this period too, decolonization is part of the history. And in the former colonies, we start to see revolution, seating of power being part of the triggers around decolonization, a whole new shift in thinking forced upon European nations in some ways, but the colonies was something they probably didn't want to administer. They did still want to get the goods, the raw materials that were coming out of there. And you're going to read about it. I'm not going to talk about that here. They had the promise of modernization or development, unilineal kind of evolutionary thinking going behind that. If we can put in the right sort of incentives and the right sort of supports, then we can help lift people out of poverty. They can become like us, is how the thinking goes in the world in there. The label of the Third World appears, but we see instead continued impoverishment, which the likes of Frances Moore Lapp start to recognize. And there's a number of people thinking along this, but Lapp is one of the persons you'll be reading about. She notices continued impoverishment, and she starts to develop ideas that are very much along the lines of underdevelopment, dependency theory. What the West is actually more interested in is keeping these nations in the positions that they're in, dependent on the West, keeping them poor because that's in the better interests of the sovereign nations who were once in control of these nations politically, and now it's much more of an economic kind of bind. And that's where we start to find world systems theory elaborated much more in the first reading that you're going to be doing. Okay. Parallel stories. So it's tempting to think about these in parallel. And part of what's going on here is we're treating them in that way. We tease them out in order to be able to understand them, get a sense of what's going on, but keep in mind always the interweaving that is so much a part of this. An approach to the global south and the global north. This is a very recent paper. It's fundamentally intertwined. And that's one of the points that Francis Moore Lapp was also making, and many other writers in this area. They're not separate, distinct first worlds and third worlds. It complicates conventional mapping, aligns locations previously understood as unrelated, and forces a recognition of individual sites and their residents as both intensely specific and thoroughly interconnected. Key insight there, intensely specific, thoroughly interconnected, fits very much with the Padyarai's notion of globalization. Thoroughly interconnected globally through the forces of transnational capitalism and the strategies for resisting, or at least responding to the threat of being overpowered by those forces, in a unit titled Global Change Local Responses. It's in these responses that we also now want to focus. Okay, that's just a way of setting up, giving you some key terms, understand the terms, start using them, start building them as part of your vocabulary. You're building for yourselves stories that you can relate, that you can reproduce in some ways about the developments of the last 150 to 200 years across the globe. Big stories. We're not looking for fine detail. We're looking for that sense of the narratives that develop. And that's what we're really aiming for at the end of this particular module. Good luck. Enjoy the reading. Enjoy the grappling with the ideas. See you around.